back to our seminar. Tonight we're talking again about should Christians go to war. And tonight we're going to be looking first at the early Christian disapproval of war. Okay? If you look at your outline, it's pretty thick. There's a lot of stuff there. The section that we went through yesterday in the book that I have is about 50 pages. The section that we're going through today is about 100 pages. So there's a lot of information that we have to cover tonight. And we're going to be doing a lot of reading. Okay? There's really no way around that because we're investigating some evidence. And all we can do is look. So as a review from last night, we looked at the teachings of Jesus, right? We looked at statements that he made that said things that were not compatible with war, right? If you follow those statements, there's no way that you can go to war and fight and still follow those teachings of Jesus. Okay? We looked at some other considerations that people have, some different arguments that people make against those statements and how they're used. But we saw that none of them really had any valid objections, right? We saw that the evidence shows that Jesus was a peaceful and gentle man. Right? He did not use violence of any kind. Okay? Even in that episode with the clearing out of the temple, we saw that the whip that he supposedly used on people, he didn't use it on people. The gospel of John used on the sheep and the cows. Right? So no violence was done on anybody there. And that's the only place where Jesus ever comes anywhere close that we see committing violence. We saw that the evidence shows he taught his disciples to act the same way, right? To follow these principles of love for everybody, love for your neighbor, love for your enemy, and his principles of non-resistance, right? Don't resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on one cheek, you turn the other. If someone makes you go within 1 mile, you go over 2. Right? If someone's going to take something away from you, you give it to them. Those are not easy teachings, right? Those are very hard sayings. But those are the things that Jesus taught his disciples to do. We looked at several objections, like we said, and we didn't find anything that could not be explained without going against this conclusion, right? There was nothing in there that really went against our basic conclusion. So, looking at that, tonight we're going to go into the early Christian writings. Some of the New Testament, later on into the church fathers and thinkers and writers for the first 2 or 3 centuries. And we're going to see what they said. Right? How did they apply these teachings of Christianity? Because we have to remember that these early Christians, they were living in difficult times. Right? Christianity was illegal. There was fierce persecution for much of those 300 years. And so the things that they believed are very important to us. Right? And the way that they lived might serve as a very important example for us in how we interpret Jesus' teachings and how they apply to us today. So with that, we're going to turn to the early Christian disapproval of war. Right? These things that the early Christians, in ways that they disapprove of warfare. Now, if you look at the New Testament, there's nothing in there really about war. Just like we saw in the teachings of Jesus, Jesus doesn't make any direct statements about going to war, right? There's no statement in the New Testament, don't go to war, right? Don't be a soldier. He's not there. But you consider the occasion, right? There wasn't really much of a chance for anyone to talk about those kinds of things. The situation in the Roman Empire at that time, there weren't a lot of wars going on, especially in that era. Just near the end of the time in the New Testament, the Jewish War of AD 70, those are some things that we see coming up. But for the most part, there wasn't a lot of opportunity to address it. There were lots of more important problems, right? immorality and idolatry, just general things about fairness and family relationships. Right? Those are the things that the New Testament talks most about. There are a few references maybe to wars and battles. In the New Testament, there's references to fighting, but those seem to be more about struggles, right? And strife and arguments, right? Not so much actual physical combat, hand-to-hand combat, but fighting with words and battling against spiritual forces.
I just remember the argument that he said, I did not come to bring peace, but also war.
We'll see that. We'll go back to that tomorrow night. Okay, that's a good question. We talked today, but we'll talk about that tomorrow night. One thing to keep in mind is that that's mostly just a metaphor for fighting between people that don't agree with Jesus. Let's go on. So we're going to take our study here. We're going to start out with a look at the general condemnation of war. Right? Condemnation of war in the abstract. We're going to look at lots of writers. We're going to be reading what they say. So there's a guy, Aristides, he said about the Greeks. This is what he said. For if their gods did such things, why should they themselves not do them? For thus, from this pursuit of error it has fallen to men's lot to have continual wars and massacres and bitter captivity. Right? The Greeks thought that their gods were fighting, and they thought that their gods liked fighting. Right? He said, well, there's no wonder then that men are fighting and having all these wars if that's what they think that their gods do. And he discredits some of their gods, like Ares and Heracles, right? Because of the warlike character that they had. Right? Justinus said evil angels and demons went around sowing murderous wars, adulteries, excesses, every wickedness among men. All these things came from evil demons, according to him. A man named Athenagoras, he talks about unjust war and the things that happen to it in it. And he talks to them as the worst of sins. Right? These things like the slaughter of thousands of men, right? The razing, burning of cities, the burning of houses with their inhabitants still inside, the devastation of the land, the destruction of entire populations. Those are terrible, horrible things. And that's what happens in war. He says those things could not be adequately punished by any amount of suffering in this life. There's no way to punish those kinds of crimes. They're so horrible. He also says in another place that Christians cannot endure to see a man put to death even justly. One thing that we're considering alongside this question of war is how did Christians feel about punishment of wrongdoers, right? And capital punishment. We're going to get a little bit more into that later, but this is one thing that he mentions. A man named Tertullian, when he talks about Jesus and Peter, when Peter cuts off Malchus's ear, he says that Jesus cursed the curse of the sword forever after. He criticizes the Gentiles' greed of gold, right? Those soldiers, they were just in it for the money, right? That's why they hired them out for military service, mercenaries, just getting what they could. Another man named Cyprianus, he speaks about the bloody horror of war, the bloody camps. He says the world is wet with mutual bloodshed. And homicide is a crime when individuals commit it, but it's called a virtue when carried on publicly. Not the reason of innocence, but the magnitude of savagery demands impunity for crimes. What does that mean? If I were to go and kill a man, that's murder, right? Everyone would condemn me, right? But if I, as a general or as a powerful warrior, go and kill hundreds or thousands of men, wow, that's great. You're so brave. You're so wonderful, right? It's the same crime. But the one is so horrible, so bad, that we can't bear to think of it in the same way. And so we excuse it with something else. The Didascalia forbids taking money for the church from any magistrates that have been polluted by war. Right? The guys that are leading, the magistrates, the governors and judges, any of them that have been involved in war, this writing says the church is not allowed to take any money from them. Arnobius says this about men's souls: forgetting that they are from one source, one parent and head, should tear up and break down the rights of kinship, overturn their cities, devastate lands in enmity, make slaves of free men, violate maidens and other men's wives, hate one another, envy the joys and good fortune of others, and in a word, all curse, carp at, and rend one another with biting of savage teeth. You think about that. We're all from the same source. If you're a Christian, you believe we all came from God. Right? And we all have one common ancestry, which means that we're all brothers. Right? How can we tear each other apart?
Due to conflict of politics and religion.
But why would we do that? No. Except that we forgot that we're related and we do these horrible things. Lactantius later says of the Romans, if anyone has slain a single man, he's regarded as contaminated and wicked. And they won't even let him go into the earthly dwelling of the gods. If you're just a murderer, you can't go into the temple anymore. But he who has slaughtered endless thousands of men, deluged the fields with blood and infected rivers with it, is admitted not only to a temple, but even to heaven. Because the Romans believed that their powerful generals would go on to become gods. That's how they believed the gods came to be. And they invited them into their pantheon because of their things. So these things all just go to show that there are lots of Christians and they did not approve of the practices of the people at that time. Lactantius, he criticizes the definition of virtue as putting your country first. Right? Oh, I have to serve my country. I have to help my country. Right? He says, why? He points out that if you do that, if you want to make your country bigger and better, right? You're trying to make your borders go further and further, well, that means you've got to press in on somebody else's borders, right? You've got to take over somebody else's land. He says all these things are not virtues, but the overthrowing of virtues. For in the first place, the connection of human society is taken away. Innocence is taken away. Abstention from what is another's is taken away. When you start going to advance your country over somebody else's country, well, you start taking things from other people. You start taking things that don't belong to you. You forget again that you're brothers with those people, even though they're in a different country than you. He says, in fact, justice itself is taken away. For justice cannot bear the cutting asunder of the human race, and wherever arms glitter, she must be put to flight and banished. For how can he be just who injures, hates, despoils, and kills, and those who strive to give advantage to their country do all these things? Okay? Those are some pretty powerful words. But how can that be justice? Well, you can see very clearly that the early Christians had a very strong understanding of the law. They did not approve. These things that we read here, they're not just voices of one or two men, right? But they represent the teachings of the whole church. And we'll see that as we go along. These things also show us how closely connected murder and warfare were connected in the Christian mind. But to them, murder and war were the same thing. It didn't matter if you killed one man or you killed 1,000. If you did it for revenge or pride or for your country, it doesn't matter. Well, because really, if it's your own pride or pride of your country, it's still pride. Right? You're still trying to take something that doesn't belong to you. Right? None of those things match up with the teachings of Jesus that we saw. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Who here wants to be killed? Now, aside from that, aside from this general condemnation of war, we want to look at the essential peacefulness of Christianity. Right? Christianity is all about peace. And peace really meant a lot of different things to Christians now and then. Peace isn't just about war. It's about our reconciliation between ourselves and God, that we're made right with God. It's an end to the passions and desires that we have in our heart, these evil things that come out from us. We have peace in our heart. The harmony and agreement that normally rule the Christian community, everyone getting along and working together, that's peace. Jews and Gentiles becoming one, being reconciled to each other. Immunity from annoyance and persecution at the hands of pagans. If you could get out of the persecution, you had peace. Right? If the pagans weren't always bothering you, then you had peace. And freedom from distractions, from toil and labor, from danger, and of course from actual war. Peace is very important. Christianity is all about peace. All these things come together when we think of Christianity. Now, when we look in the writings of these early Christian writers and the New Testament and everything else, peace is mentioned a lot of times without mention to war, right? It's in all these other cases as well. So we can't just pull out all the verses and all the passages that talk about peace, because we would be here for a very long time and we wouldn't learn much else than, yeah, Christianity is really peaceful. But just the simple fact that Christianity is so closely connected to peace, right? That says something about the Christian attitude to war. Because if all your life is devoted to peace, what place is there for war? Paul tells the Romans, if possible, as far as it lies in your power, be at peace with all men. The author of the Hebrews says, pursue peace with all men. Matthew quotes the words of Jesus, happy are the peacemakers. Right? They will be called sons of God. Luke, at the birth of Jesus, he says that angels sang, glory to God in the highest and peace among men whom he favors. Zacharias, in the book of Luke, prayed to God for God to guide our feet in the way of peace. Outside of the New Testament, Clement of Rome prays for the rulers of his time. He says, give them, Lord, health, peace, concord, stability, that they may administer without offense the government given to them by you. Lord, direct their counsel, in order that they, administering piously with peace and gentleness, the authority you gave them may find favor with you. That's very interesting. He prays for the rulers, right? He sees that they have a place of authority, but he wants them to rule rightly and with peace, so that peace will extend out. Nobody really wants to live under a corrupt government full of tyrants and evildoers, right? We all want peaceful people in charge of us, but it doesn't always happen. Ignatius exclaims, nothing is better than peace, by which all war of those in heaven and those on earth is abolished. Justinus told the emperors that the Christians were the best allies and helpers he had in promoting peace. Well, the Christians were often looked at as crazy, right? As evil, as doing all these terrible things, and being a drain on society. But he says, no. We're your best allies. Because Christians believe in a punishment coming in the future. Right? We believe that God knows everything. And so, knowing that, that's a much stronger deterrent from doing wrong than any kind of law. Because as long as I don't get caught, I can do whatever I want. I can break whatever laws I want. And as long as I don't get caught, I won't get punished. But for the Christian, there's no not getting caught. We know that God will punish us for all these things that we've done. And all these secret things will come out. Right? So that's something very interesting. He says, many people shall go and this is a prophecy from the book of Isaiah and from the book of Micah. Right? Many people shall go and say, come you, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall come forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, and he shall judge among the nations, and convict many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning knives. Nation shall not lift sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. This is a prophecy about the future. Sometime when God is going to come and teach the people and judge them, and there's going to be a great change in how people live. And as you look throughout the writings of the early church believed that it was the fulfillment of this prophecy, right, about the abolition of war. It's quoted by Justinus, Irenaeus, Tertullianus, Origenes, Eusebius, others. There's all these different guys quote this. And they say, this is being fulfilled right now. Right? This is why we don't do these things anymore. We used to be these people that fought and killed, but not anymore. You don't have time to quote all those discussions that they have of this passage. Moving on, Clemens of Alexandria says, we are being educated not in war, but in peace. Arnobius, again, we go back to him, he tells the pagans that wars have diminished since Christ came. Right? Says because the pagans were making the argument that because the Christians weren't worshiping their Roman gods, that all these wars and terrible things were happening. But he says, no, you got it wrong. Wars are getting less. The wars that are there are not because we're not worshiping your God, but because you're not worshiping ours. He tells them, for since we, so large a force of men, have received from his teachings and laws that evil ought not to be repaid with evil, that it is better to endure wrong than to inflict one, to shed one's blood rather than to stain one's hands and conscience with the blood of another. And the ungrateful world has been long receiving a benefit from Christ, through whom the madness of savagery has been softened, and has begun to withhold its hostile hands from the blood of a kindred creature. There were a lot of Christians in the world, right? Some estimates say that by the time of Constantine, 1/10 of the Roman Empire had converted to Christianity. And that was all under the fire of persecution and all sorts of things. There were a lot of Christians, and they were making a big change in the world around them. The world was receiving a great benefit because there were lots and lots of people that were not being bad anymore, that were not fighting anymore. And that's what we saw yesterday when we talked about the idea that if everyone was going to be a Christian, then society would collapse. Right? Evil people would just take over. But it doesn't work that way. Right? Because as more and more people become Christians, there's fewer and fewer evil people to take over. Right? Now, some people argue looking at these statements about peace, that these Christians had no idea what they were talking about. That they weren't considering the big problems in life. You know, how do we deal with crime, and how do we deal with war, right? If some other nation is going to attack us, how do we deal with that? There's a scholar named Lecky. He says the opinions of the first Christians, or the Christians of the first 3 centuries, were usually formed without any regard to the necessities of civil or political life. No, there's things that have to be done. Well, to maintain our way of life. And the idea is that if we follow these Christian principles, that we can't do that anymore. And he says that when the church finally gained its ascendancy, when it became the leader of the world, right? Because we see a shift from the church being persecuted to, a few centuries later, the Holy Roman Empire, right? With the Catholic Church leading the way, right? There's a shift. And he says that when that shift happened, the church had to change its feelings on things, right? Because there were new responsibilities that it had. But one thing to consider, though, is that perhaps these principles that Jesus has created and laid down for us, perhaps these principles actually give us a better solution to the problems of war and crime than we've ever had before. Right? Because if they do, then that's not a valid point. Society might not be the same, but there's a lot about society that people don't like, right? And these Christian principles address a lot of those problems. And it's very interesting how there are many people these days that aren't even Christians that still want to follow Christian principles, right? Because they're good. Yet many Christians turn away from those principles, right? We see that really what happened when the church came into power and Constantine basically made Christianity legal and all these people started to become Christians, there was no more persecution, right? The change in the church was not because of some new experience that they had, some new worldview. It was really because she started to relax her moral purity. Right? Instead of saying, we really have to follow all these teachings of Jesus, he was really being serious. He said, it's okay. You can't be expected to do that. Right? That's too hard. And we just start making it easier and easier and easier. Because that's the way things go. They go from strict, and they just get more and more relaxed, until society falls apart. And then everything goes back to being strict again, and it kind of goes down. It's like a cycle. Same thing kind of happened in the church. And when you think of the world today, how many Christians there are that don't follow Christian principles. Not just the ones we're talking about, but basically none at all. They're just Christians in name. Right? All the people in the world that aren't Christians, they look at us and say, what are you doing? You don't believe in Jesus. I remember a quote from Gandhi. Right? I like your Jesus, but I don't like your Christians. Right? I like your Christ, but I don't like your Christians. We really have to be like him. That's what they did. Let's keep going. We've seen that Christians, they generally condemned war. Christianity was a religion of peace. But how did Christians really treat their enemies? And people that did wrong? People that had hurt them, right? Or stolen from them. Or slandered them. Right? How did they treat wrongdoers? Because that's an important question. But it's very easy to say, oh, you shouldn't go to war. Right? If somebody hits you on the one cheek, let him hit you on the other side. Right? But you can say that and not do it. Right? Lots of people say that. But did these early Christians really do it? Well, as we look at the facts, we'll see that they really held to these teachings about love and non-resistance in a very literal way, right? They believed Jesus was being entirely serious and literal. They didn't try to get out of it. They refused to take criminals to court. Wrongdoers, people that hurt them, they wouldn't take them to court, right? Some of them would even ask for their forgiveness when the judges or the police would come. Right? It's very interesting. So this fact really shows us that, some things we were talking about yesterday, Jesus' teachings are not meant just for a perfect society. Right? That's one way people try to get out of following the teachings of Jesus. Well, those are just meant for a perfect society. Really? Well, these guys followed them for hundreds of years. In the most horrible circumstances that you could imagine. Right? That really wasn't a perfect society. These things, they're not just about spirit and attitude. Jesus wasn't just saying you need to have a good attitude, you need to feel this way. No, he's talking about your actions too. Right? You change your mind, you'll change your actions. This is an inward and outward thing. Right? And they really apply to both private and public relationships. Right? That was one of the objections that we saw about Jesus' teaching, that perhaps when he says, don't resist an evil person and turn the other cheek and all that he's just talking about between you and another person. And that doesn't apply when governments get involved. But we'll see that the early Christians did not feel that. And when you stop and think about the fact that these same simple-minded Christians that held so closely to the teachings of Jesus did more for the purification of the world than anyone has before or since. Well, think of the world at that time. And think of the world that we're living in today and all the things that Christianity has brought to us and all the changes it has brought in society. It was because those people lived it for real. Right? And so you have to stop and think that maybe those principles that we're talking about aren't quite so foolish as they seem to be at first. Difficult, sure, but foolish by no means. Now, Paul goes on, we're talking about treatment of wrongdoers. He says, may the Lord make you to increase and abound in love toward one another and towards all. Love towards all. See that no one repays to anyone evil in return for evil, but always pursue what is good toward one another and toward all. That sounds pretty much like you're going to treat all people the same way, regardless of what they do. He tells the Galatians, as we have opportunity, let us work that which is good toward all. To the Corinthians, what business of mine is it to judge outsiders? Outsiders, God will judge. Right? There was a problem in the church. But, we deal with these problems in the church. Outsiders, that's not my concern. We leave that up to God. He tells the Romans, repay to no one evil for evil. If as far as possible it lies in your power, be at peace with all men. Right? We saw that earlier. Do not avenge yourselves, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. That goes hand in hand with what Jesus says. If someone strikes you on the one cheek, turn to him the other also. Don't hit him back. Right? Don't think that you have some right to your own vengeance. God says, vengeance is mine. I will repay. Paul says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. And by doing this, you will heap coals of fire on his head. Your enemy will be very confused. at your kindness. Okay? Do not be conquered by evil, but conquer evil with what is good. Owe no man nothing except mutual love. For he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. For the command, you will not commit adultery, you will not kill, you will not steal, you will not covet, and whatever other command there is summed up with this saying, you will love thy neighbor as thyself. Love does not work evil on a neighbor. Love, therefore, is the fulfillment of the law. You want to do what's right, love. Because if you love your neighbor, you're not going to hurt him. Now, does that mean that I'm only supposed to love my neighbor, the person who lives right next to me? Right? What about the person that lives in the country next to me? Right? Or the province next to me? Right? What if my country's at war with that country? Are they still my neighbor? In 2 Timothy, Paul says, the servant of God ought not to fight, but to be mild to all, a skilled teacher, patient of evil, gently correcting his opponents, that God may give them repentance leading to a knowledge of the truth, and they may become sober again, out of the snare of the devil. That word for fight, so literally the word for fight. In Homer, ancient classical Greek, it was going to war. Sometimes even fighting man to man, one-on-one combat. Later on, it came to be more just, fighting and quarreling maybe. But it's the same root as the word for sword. And it's a very interesting thought. And notice he says, be mild of all. And why? Why are we supposed to be mild? Why are we not supposed to fight? Why are we supposed to be patient? Because God might bring people to repentance. Right? We talked about that yesterday, right? When we talked about Jesus' sacrifice. Right? Jesus came and died. And a lot of people will look at the events of Jesus' life and where Jesus has put the sword away. Right? And all these things that Jesus says where he did not allow his disciples to defend him. Right? Because he had to die. People will say, well, Jesus had to die, so he had to tell his disciples that. But after Jesus died, well, it's different. Well, why is it different? Why can we fight now when we couldn't fight before? Does God suddenly want evil men to die? Now that he sent his son to die for them? That's foolishness. God wants all men to come to repentance. Right? He does not delight in the death of the wicked. We have to think about it. Titus says, remind them, well, he says to Titus, remind them, be ready for every good work, to slander no one, not to be fighting, be reasonable, displaying gentleness toward all men. Peter says, honor all men, for it is unto this you are called, because Christ suffered for you, even an example that you might follow in his footsteps. Because when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten. He entrusted himself to him who judges righteously. See that? That's what we saw before. God is the one who will take vengeance. Okay? God's the one that knows. God has the power. If we're going to follow Christ, we know that. We know that God is the one. That's what Jesus did. We have to leave it up to God. Peter says, finally, let all be humble, not returning evil for evil or abuse for abuse, but on the contrary, blessing. For unto this you were called in order that you might inherit the blessing. For it is better, if the will of God wills, to suffer for doing right, rather than for doing wrong. Because Christ also suffered, once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, in order that he might bring us to God. Okay? People say, well, talking to someone last night after the seminar. They said, well, if he hits me, I have to defend myself. Really? What did Jesus say? If he hits you on one side of the face, you turn the other. I can't accept that. I'm sorry, my friend. If you can't accept that, you can't accept Jesus. Right? Because that's what he said. Well, that's what he taught. That's what his disciples taught as well. It's not easy. These things are very hard. But, look at that. Christ died to bring us to God. Right? That's what we want. We want to get out of this wicked world. Go back to God. We want others to come with us. So when you look at this, you can see pretty easily how much Jesus' teachings and his way of life really influenced his apostles. Right? Because they taught these things very hard. And that first generation of Christians did the same. If you look in the Didache, this is a big piece of text here. It says, this is the way of life. First, you will love the God who made you. Second, your neighbor as yourself. And all things, whatever you would not want to be done to you, do not do to another. You will not plan any evil against your neighbor. You will not hate any man. But some you will reprove, some you will have mercy, for some you will pray, for some you will love above your own soul. You will not become liable to anger, for anger leads to murder. Nor jealous, nor contentious, nor passionate, for from all these things murders are born. Okay? Here's a practical example of how this love that Jesus has can be applied. There's a story that I'll read here from the writings of Clint of Alexandria. And he wrote this story about John, the Apostle John. Now, it may very well be that this story is not true, right? That he made it up. But it could very well be true, and it seems in character with the John that we see, with Jesus Christ. In the story, basically, John, he's visiting a church in one city, maybe Smyrna. And there he sees a man, a young man at the church. He's a heathen, right? And John looks at him and he likes him, right? He says, this is a good guy. And he goes over, he has a good feeling about him. He takes that young man and he entrusts him to the bishop's care there in the church. And there's other Christians around. They see that this man John is said, take care of this kid. Well, after John leaves, the bishop takes that young man, he takes him home, he teaches him, he baptizes him, and then he thinks the young man is secure, right? That he's good. He's a Christian now. He's part of the church. He's part of the family. So he neglects him, right? He kind of leaves him on his own. Well, with no one to watch out for him, what happens to young men who don't have anyone to watch out for them? Bad companions come along, right? And slowly but surely they corrupt this young Christian man. And they get him to do more and more evil things until they get him to commit some great crime. Well, after that, he runs away with them into the mountains as a brigand chief, as their leader of this group of bandits, right? And they go around and they're committing various acts of bloodshed and cruelty, hijacking people along the way. Meanwhile, John comes back, comes through the city again, and he asks about the young man and finds out what's happened. What does he do? He calls for a horse and a guide, And after a long journey into the mountains, he comes to the hideout of these thieves, and he finds this man. And he finds himself unarmed there. No weapons, just walking up. And when the young man sees him, he runs away ashamed. Because he knows all the horrible things that he's done. And the old man, the Apostle John, walks after him. And he cries out, "My child, why do you flee from me, your own father? Unarmed and old as I am. Have mercy on me, my child, fear not. You still have hope of life." He says, I will give account of Christ. I will give account of you to Christ. If need be, I will die for you. I will give my life for you, just as Christ gave his for us. Stand, he says, believe. Christ has sent me. What happened? Well, that young man stopped. He looked at him. Dropped his weapons. Shaking, he started to cry, weep. John approached him. The young man embraced him and started to confess all his sins, cry and weep and lament all the horrible things that he had done. Well, John, what did he do? He said, don't worry. He assured him of Jesus' forgiveness, of the Savior's pardon. He fell on his knees. He kissed the boy's hand that he'd been hiding in shame. And he convinced him to come back, to be led back to the church. Then he stayed there with that boy, that man, and he prayed with him on his behalf. They fasted for a long time. He counseled him and advised him and all these things. He did not leave until that man had been restored to the church. It says a trophy of visible resurrection. Right? That's how Christians should be. If John were not a Christian, what would he do? Oh, this man is a bandit. Right? He's a murderer and a thief. Gather the armies, right? We're going to go destroy him. But God is not our way. Because that only leads to death. But Christ came to give us life. And that's how we ought to live. Now, moving on, looking at some other ways that Christians treated wrongdoers. Ignatius writes to the Ephesians, he says, on behalf of the rest of men, pray unceasingly. For there is in them a hope of repentance, that they may attain to God. Allow them, therefore, to become disciples, even through your works. Pray. Fight for men, not against them, but that they might come back to God. It says, toward their anger, be gentle. Toward their boasting, be meek. Against their abuse, you set your prayers. And against their error, be firm in faith. Against their savagery, be mild, not being eager to imitate them. If someone hits me, and I hit them back, I'm just imitating them. Not imitating God. Another writer from the second epistle of Clement, I believe, says, for the Gentiles, hearing from our mouth the words of God, are impressed by their beauty and greatness. Right? The Gentiles say, wow, that is a powerful teaching. But then, learning that our works are not worthy of the things we say, they turn to abuse, saying that it's some deceitful tale. Right? If someone comes to you and they have a message of peace and love, and if you do these wonderful things, then you'll have a great reward. Just come and be with us, right? And you say, wow, that's great, but that's hard. And then you look and they're not doing that. They're just doing whatever they want to do, right? You're going to say, wait a minute, why are you trying to sell that to me? You don't even want it. You're not even willing to take it. He says, for when they hear from us that God says, you will have no thanks if you love only those who love you, but you will have thanks if you love your enemies and those that hate you. They hear that and they say, that's great. Wow, that's amazing. But then they look and they see that not only do we not love our enemies, but we don't even love ourselves. Then what happens? The name is blasphemed, right? That's not how Christians should be, right? Jesus says, don't just love those who love you, love everybody. But how many Christians today don't even love their fellow brothers? They're not even as good as the pagans. That's a big problem. Clemens of Alexandria says, above all, Christians are not allowed to correct violence, or to correct by violence sinful wrongdoing. For it is not those who hold back from evil by compulsion, but those who hold back by choice that God corrects. It is not possible for a man to be good constantly, except by his own choice. Right? That's true. Right? We see here, it's not the Christian way to correct things by violence. Tertullianus, he refers to the command to love their enemies, right, and not retaliate. And he talks to the pagans, and he says, look, Christians are willing to be slaughtered, right? Don't you think that if we're so willing to be slaughtered, that we would be willing to fight you, even if we were outnumbered, right? If we really wanted to fight. But we have a law that says it's more lawful to be slain than to slay. It's more lawful to be killed than to kill. That's the only reason Christians don't fight back. Right? Because after all, it's not that Christians are cowards, right? These are people that were willing to go to their death. Horrible, terrible deaths. Be tortured. And their families burned. Right? That's not cowardice. That's something most people don't have. To be able to hold on to your convictions, and follow your orders. Tertullian says, the Christian does not even hurt his enemy. He insists on obeying those teachings from the Sermon on the Mount in all cases. That's our duty. He says it is absolutely forbidden to repay evil with evil. What does that mean? Besides, the plain and simple, don't pay back evil with evil, right? We try to get around these things because we don't like them, because we're not comfortable with them, because we want to do something else. Because we like our way of life, or we want something that we don't have. But when it all comes down to it, if you're really going to be a Christian, you have to do what Christ said. Right? And so far, the evidence is pretty clear that the early Christians believed it. Now, tomorrow night, and maybe a little bit tonight, we're going to look at some other considerations. But is what we have so far. Tertullian calls the Christian the son of peace, for whom it is not right even to go to law, and does not avenge his own wrongs. Then there's other guy, Origenes. He says that the lawgiver of the Christians has forbidden the destruction of man. And so it is never right for one of his disciples to fight against a man, however unrighteous he might be. Because he didn't want it to be any part of his divine law to allow the destruction of any man whatsoever. That's not our job. You remember we talked last night? We said Jesus wants us to be like God, right? But not the punishing, sending his angels and armies to destroy his enemies kind of imitating. Because we don't have the knowledge and wisdom and authority to do that, right? Ours is to copy the gentle side of God's nature, his love, and to do our best to bring people to repentance. Origenes talks about the Jews. And he's kind of comparing the old and the new covenant. And he says that if the Jews would have had to, he says that they would have had to give up fighting and give up being soldiers and stop punishing crime if they had obeyed the gospel, right? If they had been required to follow the teachings of the gospel, then they could not have done those things, right? And he says if they had done that, then their nation could not have existed, right? That's a very interesting idea. He says, the Jews, they had a civil economy, right? They had a way of living and a government. But that government could not exist under the Christian rules because Christians aren't allowed to do those things. Now some people might say, well, that's going to lead to everything falling apart, right? All the Christians are going to get killed. Well, Origen has an answer for that. He says, first of all, God didn't want the Jewish nation to continue anyways, and he destroyed them, right? He destroyed their city and their temple, and he started to expand Christianity. And he says, he gives God all the credit for the safety and growth of Christianity. He says, but since it was the purpose of God that the nations should receive the benefits of Christ's teaching, all the devices of men against Christians have been brought to nothing. Right? Imagine. Origen's writing, I think around 200 something AD, around 250 or something like that. There's persecution all over the place, right? Christians are being killed left and right, tortured, all these things. But he says all of that comes to nothing. For the more that kings and rulers and peoples have persecuted them everywhere, the more they have increased in number and grown in strength. Right? And the history tells us that. It's not that great persecution and following the teachings of Jesus led the church to be destroyed. It allowed it to grow faster than the true church has ever grown before. Never grown since. Only when people follow Jesus' rules is this church really going to grow. But notice here, God is going to watch out for you. Right? That's one thing that gets left out a lot. Well, if we follow Jesus' teachings, then we're going to get killed, we're going to be destroyed, we're going to have all these troubles. Everything's going to fall apart. They're missing a key point. That God is watching what's going on. And he's in control of who's in control. Something to think about. Now, these statements of Origen and some of the other ones he made are very important. Because they tell us a few things. They show us that even in the middle of the 3rd century, right, 200 years after Jesus died, these very hard sayings of the Sermon on the Mount were still being followed very literally by the church. Right? That was considered the proper way for Christians to behave. They show us that these teachings of Jesus really affected how people felt about war, right? And they didn't think it was okay. And they show us that there's an interesting place for some Christian ethical standards, right? Not everyone is going to follow the gospel, right? Not everyone is following Christ's teaching. The rest of the world goes on just like it always has, with its governments and its armies and all of that. Christians are here just to make it better and to get those people to do right. There's still going to be people to punish wrong. There's still going to be nations that go to war. But as Christians, we have an obligation to seek peace. Right? We're kind of like mediators for mankind. Now there's an interesting part of the discussion. This is going to be our last point before we go to the break. That none of these writers seem to address the idea of defending others. Right? That wasn't really talked about, right? If someone hurts you, you don't hurt them back. Right? But what about others? Well, Tertullian actually takes it for granted that if you're not going to avenge wrongs against you, you're not going to avenge wrongs against somebody else. Right? We saw even Jesus, he didn't do anything to defend John the Baptist. Right? When he was imprisoned and killed, he didn't try to avenge him or defend him. Right? How strange. Because this idea really goes against the spirit of modern Christianity, right? That idea that we want to protect the weak and defend the helpless, right? There are lots of Christians who would never go to war, who would never fight for themselves, but they go to help someone else. Huh? That's kind of the rationale between a lot of fighting that happens, right? We've got to defend these people. We've got to help them. Right? Some things to consider. Wow. This is all. First of all, a Christian should always try to prevent others from being wrong. That is not a question. Right? Just the life that we live as Christians, we are trying to get people to stop doing wrong. The question is, what's the method for us to use in fighting wrong? Is it a gentle, moral appeal? Are we talking to people and trying to get them to understand why they need to change? Or are we just going to get a gun or a knife and go take care of the problem? Right? How are we going to do it? Now some people, when they look at this, they'll say, well, you can't stop a guy with words. If he's coming at you with a knife, you got to do something, right? If he's gonna hurt your wife or your daughter, right? Just talking to him is not gonna stop it, right? You've got to get in there. You've got to fight him, right? Okay. Why? Because if I don't fight him, then I'm going to fail. Well, what if he's stronger than me? What if I go to fight him and I still fail? Right? Just because I can fail doesn't mean that that's not a valid option. You know? Because failure is always a possibility. Another thing to consider, this kind of goes to what Tertullian was saying, if I can't use violence to defend myself, right? If I'm supposed to meekly submit, someone hits me here, I let them hit me here, doesn't the golden rule that I should do to others as I would have them do unto me mean that I have to defend others in the same way I would defend myself, which is not through violence. Right? Maybe I try to help someone run away. Right? Maybe I say stop. Right? Maybe I try to explain to someone who I am and that I'm not going to fight them. You know, people say, well, that won't work. Really? Do you know that for sure? Have you tried it? If you're not willing to try it, well, then the discussion is over. But if we're willing to do what Jesus said and entrust ourselves to God and not to our own fists, right? That might change things. All right, that's our break.